24th of January 1961, Wayne County, North Carolina. A B-52 returns from routine airborne alert, fuel pouring from a ruptured wing, more than 5,400 gallons lost in under 3 minutes. The crew does not yet know the aircraft will break apart over farmland near Goldsboro, releasing 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear weapons. Each carries a yield of 3.8 megatons, 250 times the scale of Hiroshima. One weapon descends by parachute, its trigger mechanisms engaged. The other slams into muddy soil at terminal velocity, burying components more than 180 feet deep. Operators expected standard emergency protocol: controlled descent, runway landing, contained hazard on base. Reality delivered something else: a debris field spanning roughly 2 square miles, a classified accident scene, and a fusing sequence that had begun without human intervention. Declassified records will later reveal a single phrase that defines the incident. One simple low-voltage switch stood between the United States and catastrophe. 150 words. 5th of March, 1958. Washington, District of Columbia. A stamped line appears in a classified policy paper, mandating that Strategic Air Command maintain a portion of its force on continual alert status, fully armed, and ready for immediate departure to designated targets. The requirement flows from deterrence logic. Survivable readiness demands weapons kept available, crews trained, procedures standardized. The policy creates what safety analysts will later call an accident pathway, a system in which nuclear weapons spend thousands of hours aloft, exposed to the routine failures of complex machinery. The expectation is clean. Airborne alert provides deterrence through assured second strike capability. The reality is statistical. Refueling mishaps, structural stresses, hydraulic failures, and human factors compound across millions of flight hours. Each sortie requires tanker rendezvous, weather navigation, crew fatigue management, and systems that must never fail at the wrong time. By the late 1950s, Strategic Air Command operates a global network of alert corridors, with bombers cycling through 24-hour missions carrying sealed, assembled weapons. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina serves as a recovery hub for Atlantic patrol routes. The policy document introduces the term broken arrow, using archival phrasing, a mishap involving the accidental launching, firing, detonating, theft, or loss of a nuclear weapon. The phrase appears in operational directives without elaboration, a clinical label for events the system is designed to prevent but cannot eliminate. Safety depends on countless ordinary components: fuel pumps, wing spars, electrical connectors, human decisions, never aligning in failure. Yet the mathematics are unforgiving. Low probability events become certainties given sufficient exposure time. Declassified safety histories from the Atomic Energy Commission note that sealed pit weapons, fully assembled and ready for delivery, introduce new vulnerabilities compared to earlier storage configurations. The sealed design eliminates assembly delays but places complete weapon systems into logistics environments where accidents occur. A later safety director at Sandia National Laboratories will describe nuclear weapons safety under operational readiness as fundamentally a matter of playing percentages. The percentages favor safety, but percentages are not certainties. By January of 1961, Strategic Air Command operates dozens of airborne alert missions daily. Aircraft depart from bases across the United States, fly preset routes over the Atlantic and Arctic, refuel from tankers, and return. The missions are routine until they are not. The system's success depends on maintaining failure independence. Mechanical problems must not cascade into structural breakup. Structural breakup must not defeat weapon safing systems. Safing systems must not rely on single points of failure. Goldsboro will test all 3 assumptions. The governing logic is deterrent stability. An adversary must know that a first strike cannot eliminate US retaliatory capability. Airborne alert ensures weapons survive a surprise attack on airbases. The engineering cost is exposure. Every hour aloft increases the probability that some combination of equipment degradation, weather, crew error, or unforeseeable failure will create an abnormal environment. By design, the weapons are ready. By necessity, they are vulnerable. 23rd of January, 1961. off the Atlantic coast, returning toward North Carolina. A KC-135 tanker crew reports an abnormality during aerial refueling, fuel visibly streaming from the B-52's right wing. The leak is not a slow seep managed by checklist diversion. National Archives documentation describes the loss rate as catastrophic, more than 5,400 gallons, approximately 37,000 pounds, lost in less than 3 minutes. The fuel loss transforms wing loading instantly, creating asymmetric bending moments and degrading control authority. Aircraft Commander Major Walter Scott Tulloch makes the decision to abort the mission and return to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. The crew includes Captain Richard Wayne Hardin and First Lieutenant Adam Mattox, among others. The expectation is emergency procedure: declare the situation, descend, manage remaining fuel for approach, land on a prepared runway. The B-52G is designed with multiple hydraulic systems and redundant flight controls precisely for scenarios like this, but the leak rate exceeds design margins. As fuel dumps from the right wing, the aircraft's center of gravity shifts. Control inputs require increasing deflection to maintain level flight. The descent begins over the Atlantic. The crew follows emergency checklists, coordinating with Omaha Air Traffic Control and preparing Seymour Johnson for their arrival. Fuel quantity gauges show numbers dropping at rates that transform the mission from controlled emergency to time pressure crisis. The aircraft must reach the runway before structural limits are exceeded, before control authority degrades beyond recovery, before the remaining fuel distribution makes stable flight impossible. The crew does not yet know the airframe is approaching failure thresholds that no checklist addresses. Physics governs the remainder. Asymmetric fuel loss creates wing bending moments the structure was not designed to sustain continuously. The right wing, now significantly lighter than the left, experiences different aerodynamic loads during descent. Stress concentrates at attachment points. The B-52G has been in service since the mid-1950s. The airframe has logged thousands of hours, including previous alert missions, takeoffs, landings, and turbulence encounters. Metal fatigue is a known variable in heavy aircraft operations. The leak introduces a loading condition outside normal operational envelopes. By the time the aircraft enters North Carolina airspace, the crew is managing an aircraft whose structural integrity is deteriorating in real time. The mission that began as routine airborne alert, a sortie logged dozens of times by this crew and hundreds of times across the Strategic Air Command fleet, has become a race between distance to runway and time to structural failure. The crew's training emphasizes procedural discipline. Follow checklists, maintain communication, coordinate actions, but no checklist prepares for the scenario developing in the minutes ahead. The decision point is not about weapons. The decision point is keeping the airframe together long enough to reach a runway. That decision will be overtaken by events the crew cannot control: the structural failure of a wing spar, the loss of a control surface, the moment when coordinated flight becomes impossible. The 2 Mark 39 weapons aboard, each weighing 6,750 pounds, each containing a sealed fission primary and thermonuclear secondary, are cargo the crew cannot jettison, cannot safe further than they already are, and cannot separate from the aircraft except through catastrophic breakup. 1957 through 1959. U.S. nuclear stockpile production facilities. The Mark 39 enters service as a 2-stage thermonuclear weapon designed for delivery by strategic bombers. More than 700 units are produced. Each weapon measures approximately 12 feet in length, roughly 3 feet in diameter, and weighs between 6,500 and 6,750 pounds, depending on configuration. The yield is documented in declassified summaries, 3 to 4 megatons TNT equivalent, with one specific variant rated at 3.8 megatons. This represents approximately 250 times the yield of the weapon used at Hiroshima. The design is layered. A fissile primary stage initiates fusion in a secondary stage, releasing energy through a carefully timed implosion sequence. The weapon is sealed and assembled for operational deployment, meaning all nuclear materials and conventional explosive components are integrated during storage and transport. This configuration eliminates field assembly delays but introduces safety challenges. The weapon must remain absolutely safe under all non-firing conditions while remaining immediately ready when authorized use is commanded. Safety relies on multiple barriers. Mechanical safing includes pins that physically block firing set access and interrupt detonator circuits. Electrical control includes power isolation, switch interlocks, and arming timers that require specific sequences to enable the high-voltage systems. Deliberate arming requires crew action, switch throws, altitude sensing, impact fusing logic. The expectation is barrier independence. Each safety layer operates through different physical principles, so no single accident force defeats multiple layers simultaneously. Reality, as declassified analysis will show, is more complex. Accident forces, breakup shock, impact deceleration, electrical transients, mechanical rotation, can initiate actions normally requiring human intervention. The later technical report from Sandia National Laboratories will focus on this gap. Safety is not a single binary state, but a chain of assumptions about which forces remain independent under abnormal stress. A weapon designed for intentional delivery from a stable aircraft platform encounters accident environments the design did not fully anticipate. The Mark 39 includes specific components that become central to the Goldsboro analysis. Safing pins controlled by lanyards are pulled during separation, a feature intended for deliberate weapon release. Barometric sensors enable altitude-dependent logic. Low-voltage battery systems power monitoring circuits. The ARM safe switch, designated MC772 in technical documentation, serves as a primary electrical gate, preventing application of power to the high-voltage firing set. Each component is engineered. Each has tolerances, failure modes, and dependencies. By January of 1961, 2 Mark 39 weapons are loaded aboard the B-52G for airborne alert duty. They are configured for laydown delivery, meaning parachute retardation is available to slow descent and enable low-altitude release profiles. The weapons are in the safe condition, mechanical safing pins installed, arm safe switches in the safe position, no electrical power applied to firing circuits. The crew has no intent to arm them, no authorization to release them, and no reason to interact with them during the flight. The weapons are cargo, inert unless deliberately activated through multiple procedural steps. The question that will later dominate declassified safety reviews is engineering specific. Which barriers are truly independent and which can be defeated by the same accident forces? If breakup pulls lanyards intended for crew-initiated release, if impact shock closes switches designed to remain open, if structural failure creates electrical paths not present in normal operation, then safe becomes conditional. The weapons are safe under design basis conditions. Goldsboro will test whether those conditions bound the real accident space. Declassified correspondence will reduce the entire safety case to a single phrase: ARM safe switch. The documentary's core tension is already embedded in the hardware aboard the descending B-52. Multiple safety layers exist, but later analysis will question whether all layers remain effective when the aircraft breaks apart over North Carolina farmland. The answers will be written in component positions, circuit continuity, and the forensic reconstruction of 2 weapons that follow different paths to the ground. 24th of January, 1961. Descending towards Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, approaching North Carolina airspace. The B-52 becomes, in the language of later incident reports, increasingly difficult to maneuver. The fuel loss has exceeded manageable limits. Wing loading is no longer symmetric. Control inputs produce diminishing response. The right wing, structurally compromised by sustained abnormal bending moments, begins to fail. The expectation embedded in emergency procedures is runway arrival. Gear down, controlled descent. Fire crews standing by. A contained event on federal property with classified materials secured immediately. Reality delivers structural breakup at altitude over rural farmland. The right wing separates from the fuselage. Major Tulloch orders the crew to abandon the aircraft. 3 crew members, whose names are recorded in official casualty lists, do not survive. The aircraft disintegrates, scattering wreckage across an area described in National Archives documentation as roughly 2 square miles. Breakup geometry determines everything that follows. The fuselage, wings, engines, fuel tanks, avionics, and weapons follow ballistic trajectories governed by mass, aerodynamics, and separation velocity. The two Mark 39 weapons, no longer restrained by bomb bay attachment points, fall independently. One weapon's parachute system deploys, whether by design, intent, or accident force, will become a key investigative question. The other weapon falls without retardation, accelerating to terminal velocity before impact. The conversion from airborne emergency to ground accident changes every operational dimension. Location shifts from controlled airspace to private farmland. Jurisdiction shifts from flight operations to crash investigation, ordnance disposal, and public safety. Hazard assessment shifts from aircraft fire and fuel explosion to the possibility of nuclear weapon involvement in an uncontrolled impact environment. The cruise mission ends. A different mission begins, securing a debris field containing classified weapon components, preventing unauthorized access, locating both weapons, and determining their condition. Declassified accounts describe the crash zone as rural agricultural land near the community of Faro, north of Goldsboro in Wayne County. The time is past midnight. Residents report hearing explosions, seeing fire in distant fields. Local law enforcement and fire services respond to multiple impact points. The military notification system activates. Base operations at Seymour Johnson Strategic Air Command Headquarters, Ordnance Specialists, Atomic Energy Commission duty officers. A broken arrow incident is declared. The immediate operational problem is dual track, search and recovery of crew, and location and safing of two thermonuclear weapons now somewhere in a multi-square-mile area of farmland, woodlots and wetlands in darkness. The debris field is not a single impact crater. It is a distributed pattern. Fuselage sections here, wing fragments there, engines further out, and weapons following trajectories determined by their separation point and aerodynamic properties. Standard crash site procedures assume wreckage concentration. This site requires systematic search across a wide area, with the added constraint that some debris is classified and must be secured against observation or removal by unauthorized personnel. First responders confront fire from burning fuel and the conventional dangers of aircraft wreckage: jagged metal, unexploded ordnance hazards from aircraft systems, hydraulic fluid, and the structural instability of large debris sections. Overlaid on these conventional hazards is the nuclear dimension. Two weapons are unaccounted for, their condition unknown, their location uncertain. Responders must operate under the assumption that weapon-safing systems may be compromised, that conventional explosives within the weapons could be shock-sensitive after high-speed impact, and that any mishandling could worsen an already serious situation. The night becomes a controlled access operation. Perimeters are established as weapon locations are triangulated from witness reports and debris patterns. Military ordnance teams are dispatched. Floodlights illuminate search sectors. The recovery mission is not measured in hours but in days, locating components, assessing conditions, establishing safe handling procedures, excavating buried materials, and maintaining security while operating on private land with public attention building. Two weapons, two conditions, two forensic problems. One weapon will be found relatively intact, its parachute system having functioned, lying in a field with components accessible for inspection. The other will present a fundamentally different challenge: high-velocity impact into soft, water-saturated soil, creating a burial scenario that turns recovery into an engineering excavation problem. The paths diverge here, and the safety analysis that follows will hinge on reconstructing what happened to each weapon in the seconds after breakup. 24th of January, 1961. Primary weapon impact site, rural farmland near Faro. First light reveals a Mark 39 weapon lying in a field, its descent slowed by a parachute system described in official accounts as having operated as intended. Archival photographs later released show the weapon essentially intact, canopy lines still attached, the bomb casing resting at an angle consistent with retarded landing. One witness description places the weapon hanging from a tree, though exact landing attitude varies across accounts. The visual evidence immediately creates an investigative tension. The crew did not initiate weapon release. No release command was given. No authorization existed for jettisoning weapons over U.S. territory. Yet the parachute deployed, the weapon separated cleanly from the aircraft, and the landing profile resembles intentional delivery more than accidental ejection. The expectation is straightforward. Without deliberate crew arming action, weapon-safing systems should prevent any progression toward ready status. The weapon should remain inert through crash, fire, impact, any abnormal environment short of deliberate activation. Reality, as documented in declassified Sandia National Laboratories analysis, contradicts that expectation. The crash-initiated mechanical actions that normally require human intervention. In both weapons, the fusing sequence had begun. For weapon number 1, the parachute deployment is part of that sequence. A lanyard pulls a pin during separation, releasing the drogue chute, which extracts the main canopy. This is the designed behavior for an intentional weapon release. The accident forces, breakup, separation, aerodynamic loads, mechanically replicated the steps a crew would perform. Ordnance specialists arriving at the scene confront a weapon whose external conditions suggest normal delivery sequence. Parachute risers must be cut or disconnected. The weapon must be approached with the assumption that internal systems may be in unknown states. Electrical continuity, mechanical pin positions, safing switch status, all must be verified before the weapon can be moved. The presence of conventional high explosives within the weapon's implosion assembly means any rough handling could initiate a non-nuclear detonation, scattering fissile materials across the site. The declassified technical report later produced by Sandia focuses on component-level reconstruction, which systems activated, which remained in safe condition. The parachute deployment proves that at least one mechanical sequence step occurred without human initiation. The question becomes, how many other steps progressed? The weapon's fusing chain includes multiple stages: separation detection, parachute deployment, barometric altitude sensing, timer activation, battery power enablement, arm safe switch position, and high voltage firing. Set readiness. Each stage is supposed to require either crew action or specific delivery profile conditions. Inspection reveals trigger mechanisms engaged, a phrase used in National Archives public summaries to indicate that some arming sequence elements had activated. The technical details remain partially classified, but the declassified conclusions are unambiguous. The weapon behaved in ways associated with intentional delivery, despite the absence of intentional delivery. The parachute both protected the weapon, preserving internal components for forensic analysis, and created the terrifying operational reality that the weapon's systems performed as designed, when subjected to forces the designers did not intend. The Sandia analysis will conclude that weapon number 1 was the closer of the two weapons to achieving a nuclear detonation. This conclusion appears counterintuitive. The weapon with the parachute, the gentle landing, the intact condition, this weapon posed the greater hazard. The reason is sequence completion. The parachute deployment is evidence of sequence initiation, and each subsequent step brings the weapon closer to ready status. The more intact the weapon, the more likely its electrical systems remained functional. The more functional the systems, the greater the chance that accident-induced conditions could progress the arming logic toward completion. The phrase, "safe until impact," will appear in technical correspondence, describing the arm's safe switch status. But safe until impact is not the same as safe. It means the switch remained in the safe position during freefall, but impact forces could, in principle, drive switch contacts toward the arm position, or create electrical faults that bypass the switch entirely. The weapon's safety depends on the switch remaining both in safe position and electrically isolated. The crash tested both assumptions. Field recovery of weapon number 1 proceeds carefully. The weapon is photographed, documented, then transported under guard to a secure facility for detailed examination. Every component is inspected. Switch positions are recorded. Electrical continuity is tested. Detonator states are verified. The goal is definitive answer. How close did this weapon come to nuclear yield? The answer will be written in the state of a single component, the MC772 arm safe switch. The declassified conclusion is stark. The switch prevented a nuclear detonation, but the report also notes that other safing features, lanyards, pins, timers, could not be relied upon in this accident type. The weapon was one switch away. 24th of January, 1961. Forward weapon impact zone, muddy field near main wreckage scatter. Weapon number 2 experiences a fundamentally different outcome. No parachute deployment, no retardation, terminal velocity impact into water-saturated soil. The weapon strikes the ground at several hundred miles per hour, converting kinetic energy into penetration force. National Archives documentation describes the result. The weapon buried itself more than 180 feet deep in mud and clay. The absence of parachute deployment simplifies some questions and complicates others. Simplified, this weapon did not complete the parachute deployment step of the release sequence, suggesting less overall sequence progression. Complicated, freefall shock can rotate internal components, damage indicators, shear electrical connections, and create impact forces far exceeding design test limits. The weapon that seemed safer because it did not deploy a chute may actually present greater analytical uncertainty because its internal state cannot be directly observed without recovery. The burial depth creates an immediate operational problem. The weapon is not lying in a field awaiting inspection. It is underground, embedded in clay and groundwater, fragmented by impact shock, and inaccessible without heavy excavation equipment. The site becomes an engineering operation. Drill rigs are brought in, boreholes are sunk, cores are extracted, and the search begins for weapon components that may have separated during penetration or remained clustered at depth. Declassified safety analysis notes that weapon number 2's condition raised questions about whether it was effectively armed by impact forces, even if it began in a safe configuration. The concern is not that the weapon detonated, it did not, but that impact dynamics could mechanically alter switch positions, create electrical short circuits, or compress shock-sensitive components in ways that mimic deliberate arming actions. The weapon's indicators may show one state, but contact integrity and circuit continuity may tell a different story. The recovery operation focuses first on locating the weapon's major assemblies, the uranium-235 and plutonium-239 fissile core. The pit is the highest priority for both safety and security reasons. Conventional high explosives surrounding the pit could, in principle, detonate from impact shock or subsequent handling if damaged. Fissile material dispersal without nuclear yield is the contamination scenario that drives much of the recovery urgency. Even without a nuclear detonation, spreading plutonium across farmland would require extensive cleanup and long-term monitoring. Drilling operations proceed through late January. Boreholes reach depths of 60 feet, 80 feet, 100 feet, seeking metal, ceramics, high explosive residue, anything indicating weapon components. The soil is clay and silt, saturated with groundwater, creating a semi-fluid medium that allows deep penetration, but also fills boreholes rapidly. Pumps run continuously. Drilling logs are maintained. Core samples are analyzed for radiation signatures and explosive chemistry. On the 29th of January, 5 days after the crash, the pit is recovered from depth. This is the engineering success that closes the immediate contamination concern. The fissile core is intact, contained, and removed from the ground. Other major components of the weapon's primary stage are also retrieved. Detonators, conventional explosive lenses used in the implosion assembly, structural casings. The recovery confirms that the primary stage fragmented but did not undergo high explosive initiation. No plutonium dispersal occurred. The site is radiologically clean, but the technical report will later note a critical gap. The secondary was never found. The thermonuclear secondary stage, the fusion component that provides the bulk of the weapon's yield, remains underground. Whether it is at extreme depth, whether it separated and travelled laterally, whether it was destroyed beyond recognition, or whether drilling operations simply missed it, remains uncertain. The unrecovered secondary becomes a permanent artifact of the accident, a classified component in the ground, requiring long-term site control. The National Security Archives declassified summary emphasizes the secondary's absence as a key unresolved element of the Goldsboro incident. Weapon number 2 is declared recovered in the sense that fissile materials are accounted for and immediate hazards are mitigated, but incomplete in the sense that a major weapon component remains unlocated. The property enters federal control through easement or purchase, ensuring that future excavation or land use cannot inadvertently disturb what remains below. Forensic analysis of the recovered components from weapon number 2 focuses on impact damage and indicator states. Did the arm safe switch remain in safe position? Did impact shock close contacts that should remain open? Did barometric sensors register apparent altitude changes during deceleration? The analysis is complicated by fragmentation and corrosion from groundwater exposure. Some components are intact enough for definitive assessment, others are damaged beyond reconstruction. The conclusion regarding weapon number 2 is less definitive than for weapon number 1. The declassified report states that weapon number 1 came closest to detonation, implying that weapon number 2 did not progress as far through its arming sequence despite the violence of its impact. This may reflect the fact that parachute deployment and associated lanyard pulls did not occur for weapon number 2, leaving more mechanical safing barriers in place. Or it may reflect the destruction of components that prevented sequence progression. What remains clear is the dual nature of the Goldsboro recovery, one weapon intact and analyzable, yielding detailed engineering conclusions, one weapon partially recovered and permanently incomplete, leaving questions embedded in Wayne County soil. The secondary's absence ensures the accident has a physical legacy that cannot be declassified away. 24th through 26th of January, 1961. Wayne County crash footprint. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base Response Coordination. First responders arriving. At scattered impact sites confront a large rural crash scene. Burning wreckage, structural debris, impact craters, and the operational necessity to control access, because some debris contains classified weapons hardware. The response must simultaneously address conventional crash hazards, fire, fuel explosion, structural collapse, and the specialized requirements of nuclear weapons accident management. The expectation in civilian crash response is straightforward: secure perimeters, extinguish fires, recover casualties, preserve evidence for investigation, and notify appropriate authorities. Reality adds layers. This is a military aircraft carrying classified systems and 2 thermonuclear weapons. Response must prevent compromise of nuclear weapon design information while coordinating bomb disposal, component recovery, and public safety, 2 missions that conflict in tempo and transparency. Wayne County law enforcement and fire services respond to initial reports of explosions and fire. They arrive to find debris scattered across multiple properties, a fuselage section here, engines in a woodlot, wing fragments in another field. Burning fuel creates immediate fire hazard. The scale of the debris field and the presence of military aircraft components trigger notification up the chain. County emergency management contacts state authorities. State authorities notify federal agencies. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base activates Broken Arrow response protocols. Within hours, the site is under military control. Air Force security personnel establish perimeters around major debris concentrations. Access is restricted. The public story emphasizes aircraft accident with no specific mention of weapons, a standard Cold War practice to avoid confirming weapon presence, location, or movement. Internally, the response mobilizes 3 institutional layers: Air Force Command for Aircraft Accident Investigation, Ordnance and Explosive Ordnance Disposal Units for Weapon Safing and Recovery, and Atomic Energy Commission technical teams for nuclear safety evaluation. The operational sequence is methodical. Radiation surveys are conducted immediately to confirm no nuclear yield occurred and no fissile material dispersal. Survey instruments show background-level readings, confirming that the weapon's nuclear components did not breach containment and that conventional explosive detonation did not scatter plutonium. This early finding is critical. It means the hazard is contained weapon systems requiring careful handling, not a contaminated landscape requiring evacuation and decontamination. Once radiation surveys confirm site safety, ordnance teams approach weapon impact points. Weapon number 1, with parachute deployed, is located in a field and visually assessed from a safe distance. Weapon number 2's impact crater is identified by debris pattern and soil disturbance. Both sites are cordoned, photographed, and prepared for detailed inspection. The challenge is assessing weapon state without physical contact. Are mechanical safing pins in place? Are detonators energized? Is there any indication of electrical continuity in firing circuits? Declassified safety documentation notes that crash forces can initiate mechanical actions that normally required human intervention, creating scenarios where weapons appear externally safe, but internal components may have actuated. This gap between external appearance and internal state drives the cautious approach. Assume the worst, verify through inspection, and establish safe handling procedures before moving components. The recovery operation requires specialized equipment, lifting apparatus for intact weapons, drilling rigs for buried components, radiation detection instruments, explosive ordnance disposal tools, and secure transport containers. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base becomes the logistics hub. Equipment is staged there, technical personnel are briefed there, recovered components are transported there for temporary custody before transfer to national laboratories for detailed analysis. Public information management runs parallel to physical recovery. Local media report aircraft crash. National wire services pick up the story. The Air Force Public Affairs response confirms a B-52 accident with casualties, but provides no details on weapons. The standard phrase, "There is no danger to public health," is accurate but incomplete. There is no radiological hazard, but the presence of 2 thermonuclear weapons in rural North Carolina creates a different kind of danger if their safing systems are compromised. The ground response also addresses human dimensions: casualty recovery, notification of families, coordination with local coroners, and support for surviving crew members. 3 crew members died in the breakup. Others survived by parachute. The survivors provide initial statements about the fuel leak, the descent, the decision to abandon aircraft, and the moments before structural failure. Their accounts help reconstruct the timeline but cannot address what happened to the weapons after separation. That story is written in component states, not human memory. By the 26th of January, the immediate response phase transitions to methodical recovery. Perimeters are secure, radiation surveys are complete, weapons are located, and excavation plans are drafted for weapon number 2. The operation will continue for days, then weeks, as drilling operations seek the buried secondary. But the acute emergency is over. No nuclear yield, no contamination, no unaccounted fissile materials in the open environment. The declassified record will later emphasize a counterintuitive technical conclusion. Some safing features cannot be relied upon in this specific accident type. The ground response succeeded in recovering weapons and preventing public exposure, but the engineering analysis that follows will question whether the success was systematic or fortunate. Lanyards pulled by, accident forces, switches positioned by impact shock, circuits completed by structural deformation. These are failure modes the recovery teams cannot visually assess at the crash site. Only laboratory examination of recovered components will reveal how close the system came to its limits. 24th of January through early February 1961, recovery sites near Goldsboro, Wayne County. The timeline marker becomes a procedural clock, 8 days of excavation work for weapon number 2, culminating in retrieval of the weapon's primary stage components. The expectation is straightforward. Recover the weapon means all major nuclear components are accounted for, catalogued and secured. Reality delivers partial success. The pit is recovered on the 29th of January, yet the secondary is never found. The drilling operation runs continuously after initial site survey. Heavy rigs are positioned over the impact crater. Boreholes are advanced in a grid pattern, seeking metal, high-density materials, or radiation signatures that indicate weapon components. The soil is soft clay saturated with groundwater, geologically favorable for deep penetration, but operationally challenging for maintaining borehole integrity. Each hole requires casing, pumping, and careful extraction of cores. Recovery priorities follow safety and security hierarchy. The fissile pit, uranium-235 and plutonium-239 core components, is the highest value target. Loss of the pit means unaccounted weapons-grade nuclear materials. Recovery of the pit means primary containment is achieved. Conventional high explosive lenses surrounding the pit are the second priority. If damaged, they could be shock sensitive. If dispersed, they create explosive ordnance hazards. The weapon's casing, electronics, safing mechanisms, and secondary stage are important for analysis, but secondary for immediate safety. On the 29th of January, borehole operations at depth encounter metal. Core samples show machined surfaces, high-density alloys consistent with pit components, and radiation signatures confirming fissile materials. The pit is carefully extracted, placed in a shielded container, and transported under armed guard to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base for temporary custody. The recovery is an operational success. The weapon's nuclear core is secured, preventing any possibility of uncontrolled fissile material dispersal. Other primary stage components follow over subsequent days: detonator assemblies, explosive lenses, structural rings, battery packs, and wiring harnesses. Some components are intact, others are fragmented by impact. All are catalogued, photographed, and prepared for transport to Sandia National Laboratories and Lawrence Livermore Laboratory for detailed forensic examination. The component inventory allows technical teams to reconstruct which systems activated, which remained in safe condition, and which were damaged beyond functional assessment. But the secondary stage, the thermonuclear fusion component that constitutes the bulk of a multi-megaton weapons yield, is not recovered. Drilling continues through early February, extending boreholes deeper, widening the search pattern, analyzing cores for any trace of secondary materials: the lithium deuteride fusion fuel, the radiation case, the spark plug. None are found. Whether the secondary is at extreme depth, whether it separated during impact and travelled laterally through the soil, or whether it was destroyed beyond recognition remains uncertain. The declassified record is unambiguous on this point. National Archives documentation states, "The nuclear weapons secondary has never been recovered." The unrecovered secondary creates a long-term legacy problem. The site cannot simply be released back to normal use. Federal control is established through land purchase or easement, restricting excavation and ensuring the site can be monitored. Markers are not placed; doing so would confirm weapon presence, but legal encumbrances ensure future landowners no restrictions exist. The 8-day recovery timeline shows the difference between immediate hazard mitigation and complete accident resolution. Immediate mitigation succeeds. Fissile materials are secured, radiological surveys confirm no contamination, conventional explosive hazards are identified and removed, and the crash site is rendered safe for limited access. Complete resolution, accounting for every weapon component, reconstructing every sequence step, answering every engineering question, remains elusive. Weapon number 2's incomplete recovery guarantees the Goldsboro incident persists in classified files and safety debates. Logistically, the recovery operation requires sustained coordination. Drill crews work in shifts. Ordnance technicians rotate through inspection duties. Security personnel maintain perimeter control day and night. Technical advisors from Sandia and the Atomic Energy Commission review findings, adjust search parameters, and provide guidance on component identification. The operation is not a quick salvage job. It is a methodical engineering excavation conducted under security constraints, with incomplete information about target location. The recovered components from both weapons are transported to national laboratories for analysis that will span months. Engineers will disassemble safing mechanisms, test electrical continuity, examine switch positions, and reconstruct the sequence of events from mechanical evidence. The goal is definitive engineering conclusion: which barriers worked as designed, which were bypassed by accident forces, and which were defeated by conditions the designers did not anticipate. With hardware in hand, the decisive question shifts from physical recovery to technical assessment. What actually prevented nuclear detonation? The answer will not come from field operations in Wayne County. It will come from laboratory benches in New Mexico and California, where engineers will examine a low-voltage switch and conclude it was the only barrier that reliably remained effective. The 8 days of recovery close the operational chapter. The engineering chapter is just beginning. February 1961. Sandia National Laboratories, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Component-level reconstruction. Engineers examine recovered weapon components under controlled laboratory conditions, seeking definitive answers to operational questions: which systems activated during the crash sequence, which remained in safe condition, and which safety barriers proved reliable under abnormal stress. The analysis focuses on a single critical component, the MC772 ARM safe switch. The expectation embedded in weapon safety design is layered defense. Mechanical safing pins prevent unintended motion, electrical interlocks prevent circuit completion, timers prevent premature enablement, and multiple switches prevent accidental arming. Each layer is supposed to operate independently, so failure of one layer does not compromise overall safety. Reality, as documented in declassified Sandia analysis, reveals dependency. Crash forces can defeat multiple barriers through common cause mechanisms. The technical report concludes that the MC772 switch was in the safe position until impact, for the weapon being analysed in that specific passage. This statement appears reassuring, but contains critical nuance. Safe until impact means the switch position was correct during freefall and parachute descent. It does not mean the switch remained electrically isolated after impact, nor that impact forces could not drive switch contacts toward arm configuration, nor that circuit faults could not bypass the switch entirely. The ARM safe switch functions as a primary electrical gate in the weapon's firing chain. In safe position, the switch physically interrupts power flow to the high-voltage firing set, the component that charges capacitors and delivers the electrical pulse to detonators. Without high-voltage application, the detonators cannot initiate the conventional explosive lenses surrounding the fissile pit. Without detonator initiation, implosion does not occur. Without implosion, the primary stage does not reach criticality. Without primary criticality, the secondary stage does not ignite fusion. The entire yield sequence stops at the ARM safe switch if that switch remains in safe position with intact contacts and proper electrical isolation. The declassified report's conclusion is carefully worded. It must be concluded that the MC772 was in the safe position until time of impact. This phrasing emphasizes timing, the switch state during the critical seconds before ground contact, but the report also discusses impact dynamics, shock loads, structural deformation, electrical transients, and the possibility that switch contacts could be mechanically driven toward closure, or that impact-generated electrical faults could create unintended circuit paths. Engineers test the recovered switch for contact integrity, measure resistance across terminals, examine mechanical linkage for deformation, and verify that switch position indicators match actual electrical state. The tests confirm switch function. In safe position, the circuit is open. In arm position, the circuit would close. The critical finding is that the switch remained mechanically in safe position despite crash forces that actuated other sequence elements. But the report's conclusion section goes further, addressing the broader safety architecture. Other barriers, safing pins controlled by lanyards, barometric altitude sensors, timer circuits, showed ambiguous performance in the crash environment. Lanyards pulled by accident forces removed pins that were supposed to require crew action. Altitude sensors registered apparent changes during descent and impact. Timer circuits received power from batteries activated by separation forces. Each of these systems operated as designed for intentional weapon release. Each was vulnerable to accidental actuation during aircraft breakup. The ARM safe switch stands apart. The report concludes that the switch prevented a nuclear detonation as it was designed to do. This single-sentence assessment becomes the centerpiece of later public discussion. The switch worked. But the surrounding context is sobering. The switch was the only barrier that reliably worked. Other safing features, while present and theoretically independent, could not be relied upon in this specific accident type. Declassified correspondence will later frame this in stark terms. A Sandia Safety Director's memo, released decades after the accident through Freedom of Information Act requests, warns that the Mk-39 did not possess adequate safety for the airborne alert role. The memo cites Goldsboro as evidence that accident environments can progress weapons through arming sequences despite multiple safing layers. The decisive phrase appears in a summary of findings. One simple dynamo technology, low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe. The engineering lesson is precise. Reliance on a single barrier, no matter how well designed, violates defense in-depth principles. The Mk-39's safety architecture included multiple barriers, but analysis showed those barriers were not independent under crash conditions. Mechanical forces that pulled lanyards also created structural loads. Electrical transients that activated timers also affected switch circuits. Common cause failure, one accident producing multiple barrier defeats, was not hypothetical. It was documented. The recommended modification is referenced in the report's conclusions. Incorporate an ALT, alteration modification, as rapidly as possible. The specific technical details remain classified, but the recommendation's existence confirms that Goldsboro drove design changes. The accident identified vulnerabilities. Engineering analysis quantified those vulnerabilities, and modification programs addressed those vulnerabilities in fielded weapons. The arm safe switch prevented disaster in this case. Future safety could not rely on repetition of that outcome. 1961 analysis period, 2014 declassification context, National Security Archive electronic briefing book release. The documentary record creates a split-screen tension, official public statements historically downplaying danger on one side, declassified technical assessments describing sequence progression on the other. The gap between "the bombs were safe" and "the fusing sequence had begun" becomes the central interpretive challenge. The expectation for public communication during the Cold War is straightforward: minimize alarm, emphasize control, avoid confirming weapon locations or technical details. Official statements following the Goldsboro crash stressed that no nuclear detonation occurred, no radiation was released, and the weapons were in safe condition throughout. These statements are factually accurate but incomplete. They describe outcome without mechanism, result without process. Reality, documented in declassified technical reports and safety correspondence, provides mechanism and process. The National Security Archive's release of Sandia analysis documents shows that crash forces initiated mechanical actions normally requiring human intervention. In both weapons, elements of the fusing sequence activated, parachute deployment for weapon number 1, separation detection in both weapons, potential battery activation, possible timer enablement. The weapons responded to accident forces as if those forces were deliberate commands. The technical phrase, fusing sequence had been initiated, carries specific meaning in weapon safety analysis. It does not mean nuclear detonation was imminent or inevitable. It means the weapon progressed through some fraction of the steps required to reach ready status. The question becomes, which fraction? How many steps completed? How many barriers remained? And which remaining barriers could be relied upon under the accident's continuing stress? Declassified correspondence provides partial answers. The National Security Archive summary notes that weapon number 1 came closest to detonation, a comparative statement implying both weapons entered sequence progression but one advanced further. For weapon number 1, the parachute deployment, intact condition, and preserved electrical systems meant more sequence elements could activate. For weapon number 2, high-velocity impact and component fragmentation likely interrupted sequence progression by destroying circuits and components required for continuation. The sequence reconstruction proceeds step by step. Separation from aircraft, confirmed for both weapons by physical evidence. Parachute deployment, confirmed for weapon number 1 by observed canopy, not confirmed for weapon number 2, low voltage. Power activation, likely in weapon number 1 based on battery-powered systems performance, uncertain in weapon number 2, barometric or timer logic, potentially triggered in weapon number 1 by altitude change during descent, less likely in weapon number 2 due to rapid impact. Arm safe switch state, safe in the analyzed weapon, confirmed by laboratory examination. The critical insight from the declassified analysis is conditional safety. The weapon was not armed during the trajectory sequence in the sense that the final firing set enablement did not occur, but partial arming, progression through intermediate steps, did occur. The distance between partially armed and fully armed is measured in the number of remaining barriers and the probability those barriers remain effective under continuing accident stress. Engineers quantify this using fault tree analysis, identify each barrier, assess its failure probability under observed conditions, and calculate the combined probability of all barriers failing simultaneously. The calculation is not published in declassified documents, but the conclusion is clear from safety correspondence. The probability was low but not negligible. The accident progressed far enough through the arming sequence that safety depended on a small number of remaining barriers, primarily the arm safe switch, performing correctly under conditions outside their design basis. The declassified report's own conclusion section synthesizes findings. Safing pins controlled by lanyards cannot be relied upon to prevent initiation of the fusing sequence in this aircraft accident type. This is a design basis failure. A safing feature intended to function in all accident scenarios is shown to be vulnerable in a specific but realistic scenario. The implication extends beyond Goldsboro. Any weapon with similar safing architecture faces similar vulnerability in similar accidents. Public understanding of close call often centers on drama, seconds from disaster, near miss, narrow escape. The engineering understanding is more precise. The accident exposed dependency in the safety architecture. Multiple barriers existed, but they did not provide truly independent protection. The accident defeated some barriers through common forces, leaving final safety dependent on barriers the accident did not defeat. Close, in this context, means structurally close, few independent barriers remaining, not temporally close. The phrase fusing sequence had been initiated becomes the documentary's technical climax because it transforms public perception. The lay assumption is binary. Either a weapon detonates or it doesn't, with vast separation between the two states. The engineering reality is continuous. A weapon progresses through a series of states from fully safe to fully armed, and accident forces can move it partway along that continuum without completing the transition. Goldsboro documented how far along that continuum an accident could push a weapon, designed to resist such progression. Declassified reviews note that with weapons fully assembled and combat-ready, the United States could not claim in an absolute sense that every action ensures safety. This is policy-level acknowledgement of engineering limits. Readiness requirements and safety requirements exist in tension. Absolute safety requires weapons fully disassembled and separated from delivery systems. Deterrence readiness requires weapons assembled and loaded. The operational compromise is conditional safety, high confidence but not certainty that safing systems will prevent detonation under accident conditions. Goldsboro tested that conditional safety. The test showed the conditions were narrower than assumed. The fusing sequence initiated despite no intent to arm, no authorization to release, and no crew action beyond emergency aircraft abandonment. The weapon systems responded to physics, not policy, and physics, in this case, brought the weapons closer to yield than policy assumed possible. 1961 conclusions period, mid-Cold War safety policy evolution. The technical report's conclusion section becomes the documentary's hard edge, a numbered list of what failed as concept, not just as component. The expectation for safety analysis is typically affirmation. The design worked, procedures held, barriers functioned. The Goldsboro report delivers something different. Systematic identification of barriers that did not function as intended, and recommendations for urgent modification. The first conclusion is specific. Safing pins controlled by lanyards cannot be relied upon to prevent initiation of fusing sequence in this aircraft accident type. This single sentence invalidates a core assumption of Menke 39's safety design. Lanyards and pins are mechanical safing features intended to prevent sequence initiation until crew action deliberately removes them. The design assumes lanyard pull requires human intent, a crew member physically releasing a weapon or activating a jettison handle. The crash showed that breakup forces, aerodynamic loads, and structural separation can pull lanyards without human action. The failure mode is common cause. The same forces that cause aircraft breakup also generate loads on weapon attachment points, lanyard connections, and separation mechanisms. The barriers are not independent. An accident severe enough to cause structural failure is also severe enough to actuate lanyard-controlled safing pins. Defense in depth requires independence. Observed behavior demonstrated coupling. The second conclusion provides reassurance and warning simultaneously. The arm safe switch prevented a nuclear detonation as it was designed to do. This confirms the switch functioned correctly, but the conclusion's placement, after noting that other barriers failed, emphasizes dependency. Safety relied on one barrier working after others did not. The phrase, "as it was designed to do," acknowledges correct function while implicitly raising the question, what if design limits were exceeded? What if impact forces, electrical faults, or component degradation had compromised the switch? Engineers understand that worked this time does not guarantee will work next time. Design margins exist to accommodate variability, manufacturing tolerances, aging effects, environmental extremes, unexpected loading. The Goldsboro accident consumed design margin. The ARM safe switch remained functional, but the accident tested its limits. The report does not quantify remaining margin, that calculation remains classified, but the urgency of recommended modifications suggests margin was smaller than comfortable. The third conclusion is forward-looking. Incorporate ALT modification as rapidly as possible. The specific alteration is not detailed in declassified text, but the recommendation's presence confirms that Goldsboro drove design changes. Engineering analysis identified vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities were severe enough to justify immediate modification programs, and modifications would be retrofitted to fielded weapons rather than implemented only in future production. This progression, identify failure mode, assess severity, mandate modification, is standard safety engineering. What makes Goldsboro significant is the failure mode's nature. Not a single component flaw, but an architectural vulnerability. The weapon's safety depended on barrier independence that did not exist under realistic accident conditions. Fixing this requires more than replacing a part. It requires redesigning safety logic to ensure barriers remain independent under common cause stress. The broader policy context, documented in declassified safety histories, shows Goldsboro as a template case. A National Security Archive compilation quotes later, Sandia assessments. Weapons deployed in high readiness states create new vulnerabilities because sealed pit, fully assembled configurations cannot be made absolutely safe while remaining immediately usable. The policy trade-off is explicit. Accept some accident risk to maintain deterrence credibility, but work aggressively to minimize that risk through design improvement. The engineering lesson becomes doctrinal. Identify single points of failure and eliminate them. If the ARM safe switch is the only reliable barrier, then additional independent barriers must be added. If lanyards couple to accident forces, then safing mechanisms must be redesigned to remain independent of structural loads. If electrical transients can create fault paths, then circuit isolation must be enhanced. Each identified vulnerability drives a specific modification. Declassified correspondence frames the urgency bluntly. The Sandia memo that becomes famous for its one simple, low-voltage switch phrasing also warns that the MK39 configuration was fundamentally inadequate for the airborne alert role. The recommendation is not incremental improvement, but operational. Restriction. Do not continue alert posture with these weapons until modifications are complete. The memo's date, within months of the accident, shows how quickly engineering analysis translated into policy pressure. The documentary synthesis is clear. Goldsboro succeeded in not producing a nuclear detonation, but it failed to validate the safety architecture. The weapon did not arm because one barrier held, not because the system performed as intended. Design intent assumed multiple independent barriers. Observed behavior showed coupled barriers and single-point dependency. The gap between intent and observation is the accident's lasting significance. Later safety reviews, compiled in the 1980s and released through declassification in the 21st century, cite Goldsboro as the case study for abnormal environment testing. The accident provided real-world data on weapon response to unplanned separation, parachute deployment without command, impact shock, and electrical transient exposure. Laboratory tests can simulate these conditions, but actual accident data validates simulations and identifies failure modes tests did not anticipate. The final engineering statement is probabilistic. Safety is playing percentages. This phrase, appearing in broader nuclear safety policy discussions, captures the Goldsboro lesson precisely. Each safing barrier has a failure probability. Independent barriers multiply protection. Two barriers each with 1 in 1,000 failure probability provide 1 in a million combined probability, if truly independent. But coupled barriers, where one accident defeats multiple barriers, eliminate the multiplication. Goldsboro showed coupling. The percentages were less favourable than calculated. The report's conclusion section ends not with celebration, but with work assignments: modify fielded weapons, redesign safety systems, improve testing protocols, and document lessons for future weapon programs. The document is engineering artifact, not public relations. Its audience is technical specialists who will implement changes, not policymakers who will reassure publics. The tone is professional urgency. This happened. This is why it happened. This is what must change to prevent repetition. 1961 through 2014. Cold War secrecy to FOIA-era releases. The documentary shifts setting from crash sites and laboratories to records desks and archive reading rooms. Decades after the accident, declassified releases and archival postings reframe what the public thought it knew about Goldsboro. The viewer is no longer watching recovery operations. The viewer is watching information recovery, the slow emergence of technical truth from classified files. The expectation for nuclear weapons accidents during the Cold War is opacity. Acknowledge the event minimally, stress safety, provide no technical details that could compromise weapon design or operational security. Official public statements following: Goldsboro confirmed a B-52 crash with casualties and no danger to public health. Weapon presence was not explicitly confirmed. Technical details remained classified. The story entered public consciousness as that time a bomber crashed in North Carolina. Notable, but not alarming. Reality, as documented through later declassification, creates tension with those early assurances. The National Archives public history blog Pieces of History publishes a detailed account in the 2010s, using declassified records to describe fuel loss rates, weapon yields, recovery timelines, and the unrecovered secondary. The National Security Archive, a non-governmental research organization, obtains and publishes Sandia technical analysis through mandatory declassification review requests, revealing sequence initiation, barrier failures, and the one-switch conclusion. These releases transform understanding. The public narrative shifts from nothing happened to something almost happened. The technical narrative reveals not a near detonation in the sense of imminent yield, but a near detonation in the sense of safety architecture, limits tested. The weapons were in safe configuration, yet fusing sequence elements activated. The contradiction is not resolved by claiming official statements were false. They were accurate about outcome, but by showing they were incomplete about mechanism. Declassified documents create documented tension between layers of official knowledge. Public affairs guidance emphasized reassurance. Internal technical assessments emphasized vulnerability. Both are factually supported, but they serve different audiences and answer different questions. The public needed to know no radiological hazard existed. Policymakers and engineers needed to know how close the safety margins came to exhaustion. The archival narrative emphasizes enduring physical legacy. The secondary was never found. This phrase appears in National Archives summaries and declassified recovery logs. It is not speculation or rumor. It is documented fact. Part of weapon number 2 remains in Wayne County soil. The land remains under federal control or encumbrance. No public marker identifies the site, but legal records confirm restricted use. The unrecovered component is permanent artifact, physical evidence that cannot be declassified because it cannot be fully accounted for. The timeline of disclosure is instructive. Initial 1961 statements. Minimal detail, emphasis on safety. 1980s safety reviews. Internal technical assessment citing Goldsboro as case study, still classified. 2000s FOIA requests. Researchers begin targeting Goldsboro files specifically, seeking technical details behind the public story. 2013 through 2014. Substantive declassification releases including Sandia analysis excerpts and safety correspondence. Each release adds detail, complexity, and technical grounding to what was previously. Summarized as accident, no detonation, move along. The National Security Archives electronic briefing book posting becomes a key documentary source. The posting compiles declassified reports, memos, and safety analyses, providing context and technical explanation accessible to non-specialists. The posting's introduction notes that both weapons were in the safe position, yet crash forces initiated arming sequence mechanisms. This juxtaposition, safe yet initiating, captures the engineering nuance lost in simpler narratives. Media reporting follows declassification, translating technical findings for general audiences. News articles emphasize the one-switch phrasing, the unrecovered secondary, and the comparison to Hiroshima yield. Some reporting sensationalizes, some provides careful context. The variance reflects a common challenge in nuclear history communication. Technical accuracy competes with narrative drama. The most responsible reporting cites declassified sources directly, lets engineers' own words convey findings, and avoids overstating proximity to disaster while not understating design basis failures. The Goldsboro case becomes canonical in nuclear safety discussions precisely because documentation is unusually detailed. Many Cold War nuclear accidents remain thinly documented in public sources. Goldsboro's declassified record includes component-level analysis, engineering conclusions, and policy recommendations. This makes Goldsboro useful as teaching case. What happens when safety architecture is tested beyond design assumptions? The answer is written in laboratory reports, not just incident summaries. Declassification also reveals institutional learning. Modifications were implemented, not just recommended. Safety testing protocols were enhanced. Weapon designs incorporated lessons from barrier coupling and common cause failure modes. The engineering response to Goldsboro was substantive, even if public discussion remained constrained by classification for decades. The documentary's method, building narrative from declassified sources, citing specific reports, grounding claims in technical language, depends on this later disclosure. Without declassification, the film would rely on rumor, speculation, and second-hand accounts. With declassification, the film can cite Sandia reports, quote safety memos, and reference specific components like the MC772 switch. The difference between folklore and history is documentation. Goldsboro crossed that threshold when archives opened. The viewer's understanding now includes what participants knew in 1961 and what emerged only in the 21st century. Participants knew weapons were recovered, no yield occurred, and modifications were needed. They did not know, or could not publicly acknowledge, the specific barrier failures, the single-point dependency, and the engineering conclusion that safety was conditional, not absolute. That knowledge required decades to surface, filtering through classification review, FOIA processes, and archival commitment to making Cold War nuclear history accessible. The final archival observation is institutional. Sandia's role as Safety Analysis Laboratory, the Atomic Energy Commission's oversight responsibility, and Strategic Air Command's operational command all appear in declassified records not as abstractions but as named entities with documented actions. The institutions endure, their participants retire or pass. But the documentary record preserves their work. Engineers who reconstructed sequence logic, analysts who quantified vulnerabilities, and policymakers who mandated modifications. The record shows that Goldsboro was not ignored. It was studied intensively, though those studies remained hidden for 50 years. 1969 assessment, long-run safety policy implications. A Sandia safety director, Parker F. Jones, drafts a memorandum summarizing nuclear weapon safety vulnerabilities identified through accident analysis and testing. The memo addresses the Mk-39 configuration deployed during airborne alert operations. Among the memo's findings is a single sentence that will, upon declassification decades later, become the most quoted summary of the Goldsboro incident. One simple dynamo technology, low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe. The expectation for engineering summary is technical precision without dramatic emphasis. Jones provides both. The technical precision is exact. The switch type is identified, low voltage. The function is described, preventing firing set enablement, and the dependency is quantified, single point. The dramatic emphasis is unavoidable. Major catastrophe is not typical engineering language, but it accurately conveys consequence. A multi-megaton nuclear detonation on US soil would be catastrophic by any measure. Reality, as documented across multiple declassified sources, supports the claim without sensationalism. The arms safe switch was the decisive barrier, after other safing features proved vulnerable to accident forces. This is not claim that detonation was certain without the switch. It is claim that the switch was the primary remaining barrier within a safety architecture where other barriers had been defeated or bypassed. Engineering safety requires multiple independent barriers. Goldsboro showed one barrier became decisive when others failed. The broader institutional context, compiled in later safety histories, frames Goldsboro within Cold War deterrence requirements. Sealed pit weapons deployed on airborne alert created readiness advantages, reduced response time, survivable second strike capability, and visible deterrent presence. But sealed pit deployment also created safety challenges. Weapons remained assembled and proximate to delivery systems, exposure to accident environments increased, and safety assurance became probabilistic rather than absolute. Declassified, policy documents acknowledge this trade-off explicitly. A 1986 Sandia safety history excerpt, released through the National Security Archive, states that operational readiness prevents us from claiming, in an absolute sense, that we take every action possible to ensure the safety of nuclear weapons. The phrasing is carefully bureaucratic, but the admission is substantive. Absolute safety and operational readiness are incompatible goals. Policy chooses managed risk over absolute safety, accepting low-probability accident scenarios in exchange for deterrence credibility. Goldsboro quantified that managed risk. Before the accident, risk assessments relied on theoretical failure rates, laboratory testing, and design basis analysis. After the accident, risk assessment included empirical data. A real weapon subjected to real abnormal environment provided real component state information. The data showed safety margins smaller than comfortable, barrier independence less robust than assumed, and single-point dependency where design intended redundancy. The documentary's closing synthesis returns to documented numbers, the facts that ground narrative in reality. 5,400 gallons of fuel lost in under 3 minutes, 2 square-mile debris field, 2 Mark 39 weapons, each 3.8 megatons yield. Pit recovered 29th of January. Secondary never found. MC772, arm safe switch in safe position. Fusing sequence initiated by crash forces. 1 switch preventing detonation. These numbers are not decorative, they are evidentiary. The fuel loss rate explains structural failure. The debris field size explains recovery complexity. The weapon yields explain consequence scale. The pit recovery confirms fissile material accountability. The secondary absence confirms incomplete resolution. The switch position confirms barrier function. The sequence initiation confirms vulnerability. Each number carries documentary weight, cited from National Archives summaries, declassified Sandia reports, and official histories. The engineering lesson becomes policy action. Modifications were implemented across the nuclear stockpile. Airborne alert procedures were reviewed and eventually curtailed, though not immediately after Goldsboro, and not solely because of Goldsboro. Safety testing protocols were enhanced to include abnormal environment scenarios more representative of actual accident physics. Weapon designs incorporated improved barrier independence, electrical isolation, and mechanical safing resilient to common cause failure modes. But Goldsboro's legacy extends beyond specific fixes. It becomes the benchmark case for discussing nuclear weapons safety limits. When analysts debate whether safety can be assured in deployed, ready configurations, Goldsboro provides empirical reference. When engineers design new safety systems, Goldsboro's failure modes inform requirements. When historians examine Cold War nuclear policy, Goldsboro illustrates the tension between readiness and safety. The documentary's method, fact-based reconstruction from primary sources, treats Goldsboro neither as reassuring success nor terrifying near miss. The record shows both. Success. No nuclear detonation occurred, fissile materials were recovered without dispersal, and responders prevented public exposure to weapon components. Near miss. Safety relied on a single barrier. After other barriers failed, design assumptions were invalidated, and incomplete component recovery created permanent site control requirements. The human dimension is documented through casualty records, crew accounts, and responder testimonies. 3 crew members died in the aircraft breakup, named in official records, families notified, lives ended in service. Survivors provided accounts of fuel leak, emergency descent, and abandonment decision. Responders worked for days in difficult conditions, recovering weapons and securing hazards. These human elements anchor technical narrative in lived experience. The final archival line is engineering judgment, not moral conclusion. Goldsboro proves that readiness has safety costs, that safety architecture can be tested to limits, and that empirical testing reveals vulnerabilities theory does not predict. The documentary does not conclude, "We almost destroyed ourselves." That claim oversimplifies and sensationalizes. The documentary concludes, "The record shows how narrowly the safety system avoided failure when tested by forces the design did not fully anticipate." The quiet ending is factual symbol. No nuclear detonation occurred. The instruments that would register such an event remained at background. No fissile dispersal occurred. Radiological surveys confirmed site cleanliness. But something occurred. A weapon progressed through arming sequences without authorization, safety barriers coupled under accident forces, and final prevention relied on a single switch. The numbers told the truth. The engineering analysis preserved that truth, and declassification, decades later, made that truth accessible. The secondary remains underground in Wayne County, North Carolina, unrecovered, unlocated, and unremarked by public monument. It is physical remainder of the accident, permanent artifact that persists when memory fades. The land above it is restricted, not by visible markers but by legal instruments that survive, owner changes, and generational turnover. Future archaeologists, centuries hence, might excavate and find thermonuclear components in American farmland, a material record of the moment U.S. deterrence policy tested its own safety limits. Goldsboro remains instructive because documentation is exceptional. The declassified record allows reconstruction at component level, identification of specific failure modes, and verification of engineering conclusions. This makes Goldsboro useful beyond its immediate historical context. It demonstrates how complex safety systems behave under unanticipated stress, how design assumptions require empirical testing, and how organizational learning proceeds from accident analysis to design modification. The record does not show a detonation. The record shows how narrowly the system avoided one and how long the decisive details remained classified. That distinction matters. Transparency requires acknowledgement of limits, not just celebration of successes. Goldsboro's declassification enables both.